Jessica's breathy laughter rang out just as Matthew kicked the door open. The cheap hotel room stank of perfume, sweat, and betrayal. The air conditioning hummed, barely drowning out the unmistakable sounds of movement on the bed. Sheets rustling, low whispers, a man's voice, rough and familiar in a way that made Matthew's stomach turn. For a split second, time stretched. His wife. Jessica, half-naked, tangled up with some guy who wasn't him. The other man, tall, dark-haired, clearly built like a gym rat, froze mid-motion, his hand still gripping Jessica's thigh. Her blue eyes went wide, horror twisting her face. But then, she had the audacity to smirk. "Matt," she purred, yanking the sheet up in some half-assed attempt at decency. "Didn't expect you here." Matthew's vision blurred with red-hot fury. He wasn't here to argue. He wasn't here to beg. With a slow, deliberate movement, he pulled the neatly folded divorce papers from his pocket and tossed them onto the nightstand. Jessica's smirk faltered. "I expected this," Matthew said, voice like ice. "I just wanted to see it with my own damn eyes." And then, before she could even open her lying mouth, her father stepped into the room. The room went dead silent. Jessica's smirk vanished as she yanked the sheet higher, her eyes darting to the doorway. The other man, who had just been tangled up with her, stiffened, looking like he wanted to disappear into the mattress. And there he was, William Carter, Jessica's father, a man who commanded respect with a glance, standing in the doorway in his tailored suit, his sharp blue eyes locked on his daughter like she was a complete stranger. Matthew had called him minutes before entering the room, telling him, "You need to see this for yourself." William had always seen Jessica as his perfect little girl, but Matthew knew the truth. Now her father did too. Jessica finally broke the silence. "Dad, shut up," William snapped, stepping inside. His voice was razor-sharp, cutting through the thick air. His gaze flickered to the man beside her. "Who the hell is this?" The guy scrambled to sit up, mumbling something that wasn't an answer. Jessica, for the first time, looked nervous. "William," Matthew said, his voice steady despite the fury bubbling inside him. "This is what your daughter's been doing behind my back. Behind all of our backs." Jessica shot him a glare, but William's attention stayed locked on her. "How long?" he asked coldly. She swallowed. "Dad, it's not." "How long?" A beat of hesitation. Then, quietly, "A few months." The weight of her words settled over the room. A few months. Months of lying, sneaking around, humiliating him while Matthew played the fool. His grip tightened into a fist. William exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple. Unbelievable. Jessica sat up, suddenly on the defensive. "Oh, come on, Dad. Don't act like Matt's some saint. Our marriage was already falling apart. He was boring, predictable. I was loyal." Matthew snapped, stepping closer. "I was here, working my ass off while you were out screwing around in hotel rooms." Jessica rolled her eyes. "So what? You want me to cry? Apologize? Please. You were never enough for me, Matt. We both know that." The sheer cruelty of her words hit him like a brick to the chest. William turned away from her, disgust clear on his face. "You're an embarrassment, Jessica." Her expression twisted. "Excuse me. You heard me." His tone was final, sharp like a gavel striking down a verdict. "You had everything. A husband who loved you. A family who supported you. And this is what you do." She scoffed. "Don't be dramatic." William's jaw tightened. "You're just like your mother." The room froze. Matthew knew that was the one thing Jessica never wanted to hear. Her mother had been a selfish, manipulative woman, draining William for years until he finally cut her off. Jessica had spent her entire life trying to prove she wasn't like her. Now, her own father had said it out loud. Jessica's face darkened. "You don't mean that." "I do." William's voice was like stone. "And I'm done." Matthew saw the shift in Jessica's expression, fear. She knew what he meant. "No," she breathed. "You're not serious." William looked at Matthew, then back at her. "You think I built this family just to watch my daughter turn into a selfish, lying disgrace?" "I'm cutting you off, Jessica." The color drained from her face. "Dad, no. You can't." "I can," he said simply. "And I am." Her hands tightened around the sheets, panic flashing in her eyes. "You're actually disowning me over this?" "Over him." She pointed at Matthew like he was some disposable object. William shook his head. "I'm doing it because you've proven you're not worthy of the life I gave you. I'm ashamed to call you my daughter." Her mouth opened, then shut. For the first time, she looked truly afraid. Matthew, despite everything, felt no sympathy. She had played this game thinking there were no consequences. Now, she was losing. Jessica turned back to Matthew, desperation creeping into her voice. Matt, tell him he's overreacting. Tell him. Matthew let out a cold laugh. Why the hell would I do that? You made your bed. Now lie in it. Her lips parted, but before she could say another word, William turned to Matthew and nodded. Let's go. Jessica shot up from the bed, clutching the sheet around her. Wait. Dad, please. William didn't stop. Matthew didn't stop. They left her standing there, half naked and completely alone. As the door slammed shut behind them, Matthew felt it, the weight lifting from his chest. It was over, and Jessica had lost everything. The elevator ride down was silent. Matthew stared at the polished steel doors, his reflection barely recognizable. His heart was still hammering in his chest, but the anger was settling into something else. Something heavier. Finality. Beside him, William stood rigid, his jaw clenched. The older man hadn't spoken since they left the hotel room, but Matthew could feel the weight of his disappointment, the sheer exhaustion radiating off him. As soon as they stepped into the hotel lobby, William exhaled sharply. I should have seen it coming, he muttered. Matthew glanced at him. What? William's fingers tightened into a fist. Jessica. She's been spoiled her entire life. I kept thinking she'd grow up, that she'd change. His expression darkened. But she's just like her mother. There it was again. That comparison. Matthew had heard about Jessica's mother in bits and pieces over the years. A woman who had drained William emotionally, financially, until he finally had enough and cut her out completely. Jessica had always claimed she was nothing like her, but tonight proved otherwise. The valet pulled up in front of them with William's car, a sleek black Mercedes that suited his no-nonsense demeanor. The old man pulled out his keys, then turned to Matthew. You staying in town? Matthew hesitated. He had planned to go home, pack his things, start fresh. But now, he didn't know where to go. His home wasn't his anymore. It was just a house filled with lies. William seemed to read his mind. Come with me, he said firmly. You don't need to be alone tonight. Matthew nodded. William's house was everything the hotel room wasn't. Quiet, orderly, filled with the kind of expensive furniture that people weren't actually supposed to sit on. Matthew had been here countless times before, but now, it felt different. He sat on the leather couch, while William poured 2 glasses of whiskey. When he handed one over, Matthew took it without a word. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then, William leaned back in his chair, swirling the glass in his hand. You still love her? Matthew's grip tightened around his drink. Did he? The woman he loved, the woman he thought he married, didn't exist. Jessica had been a lie. A beautiful, well-packaged illusion. And yet, even knowing everything, there was still a dull ache in his chest. Not for her, but for what he had lost. The future he had imagined. I don't know, he admitted. William nodded, as if he expected that answer. You will. Matthew took a slow sip of whiskey, letting the burn settle in his throat. What happens now? William's expression darkened. She's on her own now. No more trust fund. No more inheritance. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. I need you to promise me something, Matthew. He met the older man's gaze. Don't go back to her. Matthew stiffened. I wouldn't. You say that now, William interrupted. But I know my daughter. She'll come crawling back the second she realizes what she's lost. She'll cry. She'll apologize. She'll make you believe she's changed. His eyes hardened. She won't. She never will. A bitter laugh escaped Matthew. You think I'm that weak? William's gaze was steady. I think you're a good man. And good men make stupid decisions when they're hurting. Matthew didn't argue, because deep down, he knew it was true. Hours passed. The clock on the wall read 3:27 a.m., but neither of them had moved. Then, Matthew's phone buzzed. He tensed. William raised an eyebrow. Her. Matthew didn't need to check to know it was Jessica. Of course it was. She had probably realized by now what she had thrown away. That there was no backup plan, no safety net. The phone vibrated again. Then again. William watched him closely. Don't answer. Matthew clenched his jaw. He wanted to hear what she had to say. Not because he forgave her. He never would. But because some part of him wanted to know just how far she would go to try and fix the unfixable. Slowly, he picked up the phone and turned it over. 17 missed calls. 12 messages. Jessica. Matt, please. Just talk to me. Jessica, I messed up, okay? I know that. But we can fix this. Jessica, Dad didn't mean what he said. He's just angry. He'll change his mind. Jessica, pick up the phone. Jessica, I love you. Please don't do this. Matthew stared at the screen. Then, another message popped up. Jessica, you think you're better than me? You're pathetic. You would be nothing without my father. Enjoy your little pity party, loser. A cold chuckle slipped from Matthew's lips. William smirked. That didn't take long. Matthew shook his head. Jessica never changed. With a deep breath, he blocked her number and set the phone down. For the first time in months, he felt free. Morning came, but Matthew barely noticed. He had drifted in and out of sleep on William's expensive leather couch, his mind replaying last night like a broken film reel. The confrontation. Jessica's pathetic excuses. Her father cutting her off. The desperate, manipulative messages she had sent before finally showing her true colors. His phone was still face down on the table. Blocked or not, he knew Jessica wasn't done. The scent of coffee snapped him out of his thoughts. William stood by the kitchen island, pouring 2 cups, looking as composed as ever despite the storm of emotions they had waded through just hours ago. Didn't sleep much, did you? William observed. Matthew exhaled. Not really. The older man slid a mug across the counter. Figured. Matthew took a sip, letting the bitter taste pull him further into reality. She's going to show up, he said finally. William didn't even flinch. I know. Jessica wasn't the type to disappear quietly. She was a fighter, but not in a way that was admirable. When things didn't go her way, she schemed, twisted the narrative, tried to regain control. And right now, she had lost everything. The moment was interrupted by a knock at the front door. Matthew set his coffee down, his entire body tensing. No, it was too early. She couldn't be here already. William's lips pressed into a thin line. Without a word, he walked over and checked the peephole. A low sigh? Speak of the devil. Matthew's stomach twisted. Then, Jessica's voice, muffled but sharp. Dad, open the damn door. Matthew clenched his jaw. He wasn't ready to see her. Not yet. Maybe not ever. William turned to him, his expression unreadable. Do you want to deal with this now? He didn't. But he also knew Jessica well enough to understand that if they ignored her, she wouldn't leave. He exhaled sharply. Let her in. William nodded once before unlocking the door. Jessica stormed in. She looked nothing like the smug, arrogant woman from the night before. Her hair was pulled into a messy bun, dark circles under her eyes, last night's makeup smudged. But it wasn't regret in her expression, it was anger. Her eyes immediately locked onto Matthew. You blocked me. Her voice was sharp, accusatory. Matthew took a slow sip of coffee. Yeah. Jessica let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. You're unbelievable. I'm unbelievable. Matthew's tone was calm, but there was an edge to it. You cheated on me. Lied to me. Humiliated me in front of your own father. And you have the nerve to show up here and act like you're the victim? Jessica crossed her arms. I made a mistake, okay? But don't act like you were some perfect husband. You were boring, Matt. Our marriage was dead. Then why didn't you just leave? His voice was colder now. Why sneak around? Why lie to my face for months? She hesitated, just for a second. Then, deflection. Because I knew you'd act like this. Overreacting, playing the wounded victim. Enough. William's voice cut through the tension like a blade. Jessica turned to him, her expression softening. Dad, please. You don't mean what you said last night. You were just mad. No, William interrupted. I meant every word. Jessica's eyes widened slightly. For the first time, there was real fear. You'll forgive me, she insisted. You always do. William shook his head. Not this time. Jessica swallowed. I'm your daughter. And I'm ashamed of that, he said simply. The words hit. Matthew could see it. Jessica's hands trembled slightly before she clenched them into fists. Fine, she snapped, her voice shaking with rage. Cut me off. But don't act like you're some great father. You were never around. You just threw money at me and expected me to be perfect. William's expression didn't change. And look what you became. Jessica sucked in a sharp breath. For a moment, it looked like she might cry. But then, just as quickly, she turned cold. Her gaze snapped back to Matthew. You think you won, she hissed. You think you're better than me? Matthew didn't flinch. I don't have to be better than you. I just have to be done with you. Jessica let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. Enjoy your little victory, Matt. Because you're nothing without me. You never were. She turned on her heel, marching toward the door. But before leaving, she looked over her shoulder at William. You'll regret this, she whispered. William didn't respond. Then, she was gone. Silence filled the room. Matthew finally let out a slow breath, rubbing a hand down his face. Well, that was fun. William took a sip of coffee, completely unfazed. She'll be back. Matthew frowned. You think so? The older man nodded. She's not done trying to manipulate you. And if she can't get to you, she'll find someone else to blame. A pit formed in Matthew's stomach. Jessica was out of his life. But something told him this wasn't over yet. Jessica was gone, but the storm she had created was far from over. Matthew exhaled deeply, rubbing his temples as the silence settled between him and William. For the first time since the betrayal, there was no yelling, no accusations, just the eerie quiet that came after destruction. But even as the weight of it all pressed on him, he knew Jessica wasn't done. She'll try something else, William muttered, as if reading his mind. She always does. Matthew scoffed. Like what? She's got nothing left. William gave him a knowing look. Jessica has never been the type to accept consequences. When she's cornered, she finds a way to make herself the victim. He leaned forward, his expression unreadable. I'd bet anything that she's already spinning a story, and you need to be ready for it. Matthew didn't like how that sounded. By noon, the first signs of Jessica's damage control had already begun. Matthew's phone, silent since last night, began buzzing nonstop. Friends, mutual acquaintances, even some of his own family members, all sending the same kind of message. Dude, what the hell happened? Jessica said you just abandoned her out of nowhere. Did you really humiliate her in front of her dad like that? Bro, she's saying you never paid attention to her and pushed her into someone else's arms. Matthew stared at the screen. Unbelievable. Jessica wasn't just trying to twist the story. She was rewriting the entire damn narrative. William was right. She wasn't going to just disappear quietly. She needed control, and since she had lost everything else, she was grasping for the last thing she had left, her reputation. With a deep breath, Matthew opened one of the messages and typed out a response. I caught her in a hotel room with another man. She's lying. He hit send. Then, he copied and pasted the same message to everyone who had texted him. Some immediately apologized. Some stayed quiet. Others kept pressing. Yeah, but why did she cheat? Maybe if you treated her better. She told me you were cold and distant for months, man. Matthew felt a sick kind of rage boil inside him. Unreal. Even after being caught red-handed, she still had people willing to excuse it. He was about to reply again, but William placed a hand on his shoulder. Don't waste your breath. The people who believe her were never on your side to begin with. He was right. So Matthew turned off his phone. Let them talk. He was done explaining himself. But Jessica wasn't just playing defense. She was on the attack. The next day, a call came in, from a number he didn't recognize. Against his better judgment, he answered. Matthew, a familiar voice snapped. It took him a second to place it. Then, realization. Jessica's mother. How dare you do this to my daughter? She spat before he could say a word. Matthew closed his eyes. Hello to you too, Mrs. Dawson. Don't you dare act smug, she hissed. Jessica is devastated. She's been crying for hours. And now William is being absolutely unreasonable, cutting her off like this. You two have gone too far. Matthew nearly laughed. She brought this on herself. She made a mistake. A mistake. His voice darkened. She slept with another man behind my back. Lied to me for months. And you think I'm the bad guy? Jessica's mother scoffed. You were never good enough for her. She deserves better. Matthew's grip on the phone tightened. This woman. This was who had raised Jessica. It all made sense now. If better means some random guy in a hotel room, then sure, he said coolly. I hope she finds what she's looking for. Jessica's mother let out an offended gasp. You. Click. Matthew hung up. He was done. 2 days passed. Then, Jessica made her next move. Matthew was sitting in William's office, finalizing the first steps of the divorce. They were halfway through discussing legal strategies when the housekeeper stepped in, looking nervous. Mr. Dawson, sir, your daughter is at the front gate. She's refusing to leave. Matthew exhaled sharply. William didn't react at first. Then, slowly, he leaned back in his chair and muttered, Of course she is. Should we call security? The housekeeper asked hesitantly. William waved a hand. No need. I'll handle this. He turned to Matthew. Up for one more round of nonsense. Matthew didn't want to, but this needed to end. So he followed William to the front of the estate. Jessica was there, standing outside the iron gates, yelling at the intercom. "Dad, you can't just cut me off." William pressed the speaker button. "I can." And I did. Jessica's face twisted in frustration. "I have nowhere to go." "Not my problem," William said simply. She glared at the speaker, then turned her attention to Matthew, eyes burning with resentment. "And you? I hope you're happy." Matthew met her gaze. "I am." That seemed to break her. Her mask cracked, her face twisting into something ugly. "You think you're better than me? You're pathetic." Matthew didn't flinch. "Then why are you the one standing outside, begging?" Jessica froze. William smirked. "That's enough, Jessica. Go home, wherever that is now." Jessica's lips parted, like she wanted to fight back. But there was nothing left to say. For the first time, Matthew saw it, realization. The moment she finally understood that she had lost. Not just her father, not just her money, everything. And Matthew? He was free. Jessica let out a bitter, broken laugh. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away. Matthew and William watched her go. The gate shut behind them with a heavy click. William glanced at Matthew. "So," he said, "how does it feel?" Matthew took a deep breath. For the first time in years, his chest felt light. "It feels like I can finally breathe." The weight was gone. The chains Jessica had wrapped around his life, broken. The lies, the manipulation, the humiliation, all of it was over. And yet, Matthew couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. Jessica wasn't the type to walk away quietly. She had lost everything. Her marriage, her cushy lifestyle, her father's support. People like her? They didn't accept consequences. They tried to rewrite them. William must have sensed Matthew's thoughts because he clapped him on the back with a knowing smirk. "She'll try something else. Just be ready." Matthew didn't respond. He didn't need to. He already was. For a few days, things were quiet. Too quiet. Matthew focused on work, on regaining his rhythm, on rebuilding. But then, Jessica struck again. It started with a phone call. Not from her. From his job. Matthew answered, not thinking much of it, until he heard the tense voice of his supervisor, Richard. "Matthew," Richard said carefully, "I just received an interesting email about you." Matthew frowned. "From who?" "A woman named Jessica Dawson. Your wife." Matthew's blood ran cold. "Ex-wife," he corrected. "What did she say?" Richard hesitated. "That you're emotionally unstable. That you've been threatening her since she left. That she fears for her safety." Matthew stared at the wall. Of course. Of course she was doing this. Jessica couldn't take him down in the divorce, so she was trying to destroy his reputation instead. "Richard, you don't seriously believe her, do you?" Matthew asked, forcing his voice to stay calm. Richard sighed. "Look, I don't think you're that kind of guy. But you know how it is. HR is involved now. We have to go through the motions." Matthew clenched his jaw. He had spent years building his career. He had sacrificed, worked harder than anyone else, earned his position with integrity. And now, Jessica was trying to rip it away with a few well-placed lies. But she had underestimated him. "I understand," Matthew said, his voice even. "Do what you need to do, and I'll do what I need to do." An hour later, Matthew was sitting in William's office. His former father-in-law listened quietly as Matthew explained everything. Jessica's accusations, the email, the HR involvement. When Matthew finished, William exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "I should have expected this," he muttered. Matthew leaned forward. "I need to shut this down. Fast." William nodded. "Then it's a good thing I still have connections." He reached for his phone, dialed a number, and after a few moments, a smooth, professional voice answered. "This is Carter." "Who am I speaking with?" "William Dawson. I have a case for you." Matthew recognized the name immediately. Carter Reynolds. One of the most ruthless defamation lawyers in the state. If anyone could end Jessica's smear campaign before it gained traction, it was him. "You have my attention," Carter said. William handed the phone to Matthew. "Tell him everything." Matthew did, and Carter listened. When he was finished, there was a long pause. Then, Carter spoke. "I'll take the case." Relief flooded Matthew's chest. Finally, Jessica was about to learn what real consequences looked like. The next day, Matthew received another call. This time, from Jessica herself. He debated ignoring it, letting it go to voicemail. But something in his gut told him to answer. So he did. The second he picked up, Jessica's voice came through, honey-coated and fake. "Matthew," she purred, "we need to talk." Matthew leaned back in his chair. Do we? She sighed dramatically. I know things got messy between us, but this doesn't have to get uglier than it already is. Matthew smirked. You mean uglier than you made it? Jessica ignored that. I think we can come to an agreement. You drop your little, legal stunt, and I'll make this all go away. Matthew almost laughed. She was desperate. Jessica, he said, voice cold, you tried to ruin my life. And now you want to negotiate. I just want peace, she said sweetly. You don't want peace, Matthew corrected. You want to save yourself. Silence. Then, Jessica's tone shifted. If you don't drop this, I swear. Careful, Matthew cut in. That sounded a lot like a threat. And considering the legal situation you're in, I wouldn't recommend adding more to it. Jessica sucked in a sharp breath. Matthew continued. You lost, Jessica. And now? You're going to deal with the consequences. Jessica's voice trembled, not with fear, but with rage. You'll regret this, she hissed. Matthew only smiled. We'll see. Then he hung up. A week later, Carter called with good news. Jessica's false claims? Completely discredited. Her attempt to smear him at work? Shut down before it even started. And the best part? She was now facing legal trouble for defamation. Matthew couldn't help but chuckle. Jessica had spent months scheming, lying, manipulating. And in the end, she had destroyed herself. William, standing beside him, smirked. I'd say this calls for a drink. Matthew nodded. Absolutely. As he took the first sip, a thought crossed his mind. Not of Jessica, not of revenge, but of the future. And for the first time in a long, long time. It looked damn good. Matthew had won. The lies were exposed, the false accusations destroyed, and Jessica? She was drowning in the mess she had created. But something told him she wasn't done yet. People like her never accepted defeat. And sure enough, the next disaster came knocking on his door, literally. It was late evening when the loud, aggressive banging started. Matthew frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone. Cautiously, he made his way to the door, checking the peephole. What he saw made his blood boil. Jessica. Her hair was a mess. Her makeup smeared like she had been crying, or pretending to. And she wasn't alone. Standing beside her was a police officer. Matthew exhaled sharply. Here we go? He opened the door, but didn't speak. Let her make the first move. Jessica's face twisted into mock sadness. Matthew, she whispered, her voice shaking just enough to sound convincing. I didn't want to do this, but you left me no choice. The officer cleared his throat. Sir, your ex-wife has filed a complaint against you. Matthew's jaw clenched. For what? Jessica let out a dramatic sigh. Harassment. Threats. Stalking. She wiped at non-existent tears. I just want to be safe. Matthew almost laughed. Safe. From him? This woman had lied, cheated, humiliated him, tried to ruin his career. And now she was playing the victim? The officer shifted uncomfortably. We have to take these matters seriously, sir. Matthew nodded, calm. Of course. And I'm sure you'll be interested in my lawyer's statement. Along with the counterclaim, I'll be filing for false allegations. Jessica flinched. She hadn't expected that. Matthew smirked. You really don't know when to quit, do you? Jessica's mask cracked for a split second. Sir, the officer interrupted, clearing his throat. As of now, we're just issuing a warning. But if another complaint comes in, there could be legal action. Matthew held the officer's gaze. Understood. The officer nodded, gave Jessica a curt look, and left. Jessica stayed. Big mistake. The moment the officer was out of earshot, her expression shifted. The fake victim act? Gone. Now, she was pure venom. You think you're so clever, she sneered. You think you've won? Matthew smiled. Haven't I? Jessica's fists clenched. You ruined my life. No, Jessica. Matthew corrected, stepping closer. You did that all by yourself. For the first time, real fear flickered in her eyes. Because she knew. It was over. Without another word, she turned and stormed off. And as Matthew watched her disappear down the street, something inside him clicked. This was the last time she would ever have power over him. The next morning, William called. You heard? He asked, amusement in his voice. About the fake police report? Yeah. William chuckled. She's desperate. Matthew smirked. And out of options. William sighed, his tone shifting. Listen, son, I know this has been hell, but I have to say, I've never seen anyone handle a storm like this the way you did. Matthew exhaled, running a hand through his hair. I appreciate that, William. And I meant what I said before. William added. Your family. No matter what happens next. A lump formed in Matthew's throat. After everything, that meant something. Thanks, he said softly. A week passed. No calls. No surprise visits. Silence. Until Matthew received an email. From Jessica. His stomach twisted. He almost deleted it without opening it. But curiosity won. Clicking the message, he braced himself for another pathetic attempt at manipulation. But instead, it was short. I give up. You win. Matthew read it again. Then a slow, satisfied smirk spread across his face. Damn right, he won. And for the first time in a long time, he felt something foreign. Peace. Matthew stared at the email for a long moment. I give up. You win. It should have felt like a victory. It was a victory. But something about it felt off. Jessica didn't give up. She didn't surrender. So what was her angle? He closed the email, exhaling slowly. If this was some final mind game, he wasn't playing. She was done. And so was he. The next few weeks were shockingly quiet. No surprise attacks. No legal tricks. No dramatic public meltdowns. Jessica had vanished. Matthew focused on rebuilding. His job, his friendships, his life. And it was working. Until the wedding invitation arrived. Matthew almost laughed when he saw the name. Jessica Dawson. Getting married. To her affair partner. You have got to be kidding me. The audacity. The sheer lack of shame. He tossed the invitation on the counter, shaking his head. Was this supposed to hurt him? If anything, it was just pathetic. William called him an hour later, his voice dripping with amusement. You got it too, didn't you? Matthew chuckled. Oh yeah. You going? Matthew snorted. Not even if they paid me. William laughed. Good. Because I'm sure as hell not going either. That felt good. Really good. Because months ago, that wedding invitation would have destroyed him. Now, it was just proof that Jessica was someone else's problem now. And Matthew? He was finally free. The day of the wedding came and went. Matthew didn't think about it. Didn't care. Until he got the news. Jessica's new husband? He left her. At the wedding. Matthew read the text from William twice, just to make sure he wasn't imagining it. He walked out. Right after the vows. Said he made a mistake. She had a full meltdown in front of everyone. Matthew grinned. The woman who had spent months lying, manipulating, and tearing people down, got left at the altar. Poetic. Justice. He leaned back in his chair, letting out a deep, satisfied sigh. Karma was beautiful. Months passed. Jessica faded into irrelevance. Matthew thrived. He worked harder, trained harder, lived better. And one day, as he sat on his balcony, looking out over the city, a thought hit him. He had lost everything. And somehow he had won. Because now, he had something far more valuable than Jessica ever could have given him. Peace. Freedom. Himself. And that was worth everything.